question that gets asked a lot is, should I use heart rate or should I use pace and power in terms of monitoring training intensity from a single session? Today we're going to break down why, in terms of the physiological reasons why you should be using heart rate or power or pace in a particular session. And then I might just touch on at the end just a little bit about the stride power meters and how we're starting to see a bit of emergence in using a technology that might be covering all our bases in terms of a training session. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey guys, Nick here. Welcome back to the channel, talking science of endurance and everything sports science in general. Welcome to the channel. If this is the first video you're watching, please consider subscribing down below. We make content all about the science of endurance particularly, and how the aerobic system and the energy systems work to produce performance so players and athletes can outrun, outtrain, and outperform their opponents. In terms of today, like I said in the intro, we're talking about heart rate versus pace and power. When should we use different training metrics or tools to be able to monitor our training intensity? And this is a question that really, I guess, gets lost in a bit of useless debate about what people prefer, rather than let's look at some of the physiology behind what is going on in different types of training sessions to understand what might be giving us a better indication of intensity and a little bit more accuracy from our training. So the first thing I want to talk through is not necessarily anything to do with heart rate or pace to begin with, but it's the process of oxygen consumption coming into the body when we increase exercise intensity, either going from rest to any exercise intensity, whether that be low, moderate, or high, or when we go from a particular exercise intensity and then we increase it again. So what I put up on the screen here is a bit of a graph, and essentially what happens is once we start to exercise, we increase what's called the oxygen demand. So obviously we start to increase the intensity. If we go from rest to exercising, or we go to rest, we go from a moderate intensity to a high intensity, etc. We've increased the intensity, so therefore we need more oxygen to produce the energy that we are trying to create or attempting to create. Now the body doesn't have a flip the switch, and we can't just get that oxygen consumption in bang straight away. Run an effort at your VO2 intensity or at your FTP intensity just straight away. You're gonna feel like it's like, and sort of, I guess, take note of how you're feeling internally, you're going to feel like you probably don't have to work too hard to get oxygen in. And that's because the anaerobic systems play a critical role in this oxygen deficit period. So this period where oxygen demand is higher than the supply, we have this lag time in terms of the body's trying to play catch up and get that oxygen in, but we need energy in the meantime because we still want to run at that intensity we're trying to aim for. Let's say we're trying to get up to 4-minute K pace. We're trying to get to 3:30 pace, 3-minute pace, whatever it is running. I want to be able to run at that straight out the gate and go now. I need to run at that intensity right from the beginning. The body, though, can't supply enough oxygen to create aerobic energy to produce that, so we have to produce anaerobic energy to compensate. Now, this period doesn't last forever. Eventually, the body is going to catch up, and that's where we hit what's called a steady state, so where oxygen supply is now meeting the oxygen demand. When we get to there, it then really transitions heavily into the aerobic systems. So what I'm getting at here is we have to be careful in terms of the type of metric we use, because if there's a lag time in our ability to get oxygen into the system, there's going to be a lag time in terms of heart rate. And this is something a lot of athletes will know from their own training. You may have seen this before, is that when you start your training session, you'll notice a bit of a lag time in terms of how long heart rate takes to come up. Cooler conditions, it usually takes a little bit more. Warmer conditions, doesn't take as much. That's a temperature factor that can be influencing there. But if we keep everything consistent from an environment perspective, if you go up and increase the exercise intensity to a quite high level straight away, it's going to take you a long time for that heart rate to come up. Sometimes for some athletes, it might only be 30 to 45 seconds. It can be up to sort of 60, 90 seconds, depending on how fit you are. Usually fitter athletes are going to get up there a lot quicker, so you can sort of get away with it a little bit more. But lesser trained athletes typically will take a long time because what we call their oxygen kinetics, so the rates at which their oxygen consumption can increase, isn't quite as good because their processes in their system isn't as efficient as that higher trained athlete. So this has implications and real implications on our training intensity and what metrics or I guess numbers we use to monitor training intensity in our session. Because if we have this lag time, particularly for the high intensity stuff, when we're working hard for 10 minutes or less at a time and then having some sort of recovery period, we need to get to that intensity and know we're working the correct amount, because you could easily blow yourself up or underexert either way if you're sort of waiting for this lag period to catch up. And that's why in the high intensity stuff, I generally recommend using pace on the run and then power on the bike as a tool of taking out a bit of that guesswork, because we know that, let's say VO2 max intervals, 2 to 4 minutes on, equal work to rest, that type of session. I know that I want to be sitting about 95% of my velocity at VO2 max or power at VO2 max. I know exactly what pace that is, and I know that's the physiological stimulus I need to be able to improve in that session. What it also does is it allows me to give a number that I can basically have on my screen and go, bang, I've hit the intensity I need to right from the gun or as soon as I begin that effort, and I can carry that through. I know my body's going to have a lag time catching up, but as I get through the sessions, that lag is going to slowly dissipate a little bit because I'm starting from a slightly higher oxygen consumption level each time. My body's up and used to it. It's not going to come all the way back down in say 2 to 4 minutes. So using power or pace is really easy to understand. All right, this is the physiological intensity I need to work at, and that's going to stay relatively consistent as long as then you're not changing some other variable. So if you're doing those sessions on a smart trainer, 285 watts or 300 watts, whatever it is for you, is 285 watts. It's 300 watts. There's going to be slight variance between power meters. I'm not concerned about that. We just know that it's a physiological output that we know is going to be consistent. The hill is a little bit different in terms of pace. Obviously, if you run up the hill at 5 minute K pace, it's a lot harder than running on the flat at 5 minute K pace. Consider that. I'm mainly talking about flat, good conditions. Even then, when you're running into the wind, running into the wind is a little bit different to riding into the wind. If you ride into the wind at 300 watts, you're still holding 300 watts. You just be going slower. Whereas running, you have to actually physically exert that in terms of moving the body yourself. All in all, what I'm getting at here is high intensity. It's much better to go for an independent metric or an external variable like power or pace, where it's the same physiological amount of work for that effort. You know it straight away. You can look at your watch after 5-10 seconds and bang, your bike computer, and you know you're exactly on the right track in terms of intensity. You just let heart rate do whatever it needs to do. Flipping over to longer efforts, and when we start to go longer than 10 minutes, so long slow sessions, you might be doing some long threshold type efforts, a long time trial. You might be getting into things like having a look at tempo-y type sessions, whatever it may be in your training. Then it's more about, well, what is our heart rate doing? Because typically the lag time in the grand scheme of things isn't going to be cutting into what you're doing. And what I mean by that is in a high intensity session, because we have this lag in heart rate, this oxygen deficit, the body's going to take a bit of time to catch up. So you might do that first effort at VO2 intensity, and your heart rate might only be at 150 by the end of it. And then the next one, it gets up to 155, then 160. If you're an athlete who might max out at, say, 175, 180 beats per minute, everyone's going to be slightly different. But you get the idea in terms of heart rate might not be that high. So what you might do if you're not looking at pace and you're going off heart rate is you might overexert and run a lot harder to try and get it up a lot quicker, which is going to happen. It's going to allow you to get your heart rate up quicker, but you're actually running faster than what you need to. So what impact does that have in future intervals within that session? Well, it's obviously going to induce more fatigue, so you're probably going to blow up towards the back end of the session. We're also losing out in terms of a bit of time because the deficit period, let's say in a 2-minute effort, deficit might take 90 seconds. You're going to go really 30 seconds of that genuine heart rate that you needed, whereas the pace metric is going to be consistent the whole way through, or power is going to be consistent the whole way through. Looking at the longer, slower sessions, in an hour and a half training session or 3-hour session on the bike, whatever you're doing, if you're only losing 90 seconds to a couple of minutes of that deficit time, and then you can hold a pretty consistent heart rate across, and you're in the right area, that's going to be less detrimental because it's a small percentage of that session. It's a very small, minute part of the whole bigger picture. Whereas the high intensity, if you lose 90 seconds out of a 2-minute effort, you're starting to waste a lot of what you're doing. You're kind of doing it for no real reason. And again, you can definitely overexert in those high intensity efforts, trying to get your heart rate there quicker. In the longer slow, just let yourself come up. It's part of the warm up anyway. And then once you've warmed up, your heart rate's probably going to be ready to go pretty quickly. So that's where I tend to go because of this physiological change in terms of oxygen demand. Once we get up to a point where oxygen supply is equaling demand, steady state is occurring, and that's when the aerobic systems really start to kick in and perform as much aerobic work as possible. So critical in the long slow, that heart rate we start to look at as a little bit better metric. We also get a much better variation in what our heart rate's doing and have a look at things like what is our aerobic capacity improving like or looking like towards the back end of a session. We can see things start to go away from each other. So pace is dropping, but heart rate's staying the same. All right, that's an interesting look at what our aerobic capacity might be doing, or pace is increasing and heart rate's staying the same. That's good. Flip over the high intensity, pace or power is our much better indicator. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with, because I know I've already talked for about 10 minutes already, is that we have these things called stride power meters that are starting to make their way into a little bit more commonplace, particularly in running. I want to talk through maybe the benefits of technology like this going forward, and as it improves and as it gets better, is that we have now potentially a metric that is going to do both for us. And this is hopefully where the industry is going to go. And I'm actually quite excited about this type of technology, because what it means is that a power meter for runners and cyclists and triathletes who are doing a lot of their work on the bike, I'm sorry, this might exclude you a little bit because there's so many other variables that influence performance. But from a running perspective, if we have a look at some of the common things I talked about before, like if you start to run up a hill, pace on the flat versus up a hill obviously is a lot more difficult up a hill, and it's a different physiological exertion. So now we're starting to talk about, well, if we have a metric that's not pace related, it's a power output for running, we can then equate or have equivalent intensities for the flat versus the hills, which is really specific for our ultra distance runners, trail runners, anyone who's living or training in a quite hilly undulating area. Really good for you guys, because it means you're not necessarily going to have to go to a flat athletics track or a flat trail somewhere every single time you want to do some high intensity efforts. And also, you could also keep your training quite consistent, because if we know what the physiological output should be for a particular session in terms of power from a running perspective, you can apply that probably to your long slow as well as your high intensity. Why? Because long slow, you go out and go through those undulating sections, you know what the equivalent of that particular heart rate and of that particular pace should be when you're on the flat. When you go and run up and down the hills, obviously your heart rate's going to spike in certain areas and come down in certain areas because of those undulations, but you can keep a relatively consistent performance overall because you're keeping a relatively consistent physiological output. So it is something interesting to look through. I haven't personally used it myself, so if you have used a stride power meter, let me know your thoughts down below, or what your thoughts are on using power for running. Are you interested in it? Are you looking at purchasing one? Are you not interested at all? Let me know your thoughts down below. How else do you train as well? Do you like to use heart rate the whole way through? Do you like to use pace the whole way through? Always interested to find out everyone else's opinion on some of these topics. Again, this is just my thoughts and why I sort of go through that process. But if you have something else, happy to hear it in the comments below. The more comments, the better. That is it for today. I know I've spoken a lot already, but please make sure you hit the subscribe button down below to keep supporting the channel. Click the bell to turn on notifications so you're updated for new videos, and we will see you in the next one.